Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I am honored to be joined in conversation by best-selling author Mark Shaw. A former criminal defense attorney and legal analyst for USA Today, ABC, and ESPN, he has published nearly 30 books and, in late 2020, was honored when his alma mater, Purdue University, became the archival repository for his collected works. Mark's newest book, Collateral Damage, is his fifth pertaining to the Jfk Assassination. Here, he connects the suspicious deaths of Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen, two popular, powerful women who had more in common in life and in death than first meets the eye, to Robert Kennedy and JFK. It's a continuation of his groundbreaking work on media icon Dorothy Kilgallen, first explored in 2016's Bestselling The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and again in Denial of Justice. Kilgallen, who covered the Jack Ruby trial, was the only reporter to have interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald's killer and later proclaimed her intent to break the case wide open. Unfortunately, she died under suspicious circumstances before she had the chance to publish her findings, and her investigative file hasn't been seen since. Inspired by Dorothy Kilgallen's own quest for truth, Mark has been a tireless advocate for justice on her behalf, rekindling interest in a cold case that he believes can still be solved. Now he's added Marilyn Monroe and JFK to the cause, and he invites you to join him. But first, allow Mark Shaw to tell you a sad and sordid story, and one that's substantiated by cold, hard facts. I think you'll find it quite illuminating. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Central Booking. Today I am talking to Mark Shaw, a former criminal defense attorney and also an investigative journalist whose new book, Collateral Damage, is out right now. It's actually a book that connects the deaths of Dorothy Kilgallen, Marilyn Monroe, and JFK to Robert Kennedy and the Kennedy patriarch Joseph. So welcome to the show, Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on again.
It's my pleasure. So we're going to do a little something different. Usually, it's a back and forth Q&A, but you are going to take us on a journey because this book was a journey for you. It wasn't even a book that you intended to write. And yet here we are, 570 pages of this explosive new book. So you're going to take us on that journey, and I will just interject, if I have questions as we go along or possibly at the end, but I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, but please do just interrupt when you have any questions. The reason I say I wasn't going to write this book is that actually I had written 4 books previous to this one that touch on the JFK assassination. I first wrote a book about Melvin Belli, the loquacious San Francisco barrister who represented the Rolling Stones and Muhammad Ali and all these people way back when. But he also represented Jack Ruby, who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, as you know. It's called Melvin Belli, King of the Courtroom. And I have a little advantage over other people writing about this because I knew Mr. Belli. I practiced law in his building in San Francisco, got to know him, and there were some clues when I wrote that biography of him because I found out and knew firsthand that the Belli was kind of a mafia wannabe. He loved to hang around with those guys in Las Vegas and wherever. He once said he was part of the San Mateo mafia. He wasn't, but he always said that, and he liked to be looked upon as kind of dangerous. But he was really a tort lawyer, a personal injury lawyer for the most part. Got multi-million-dollar verdicts and all that when nobody else was doing that. Sued pharmaceutical companies and everything. And so when I learned that he had represented Jack Ruby, it was a shock because he had never really been involved in criminal cases. And of course, the Ruby case was a capital case.
Right.
So during the research for that particular book, I learned something that I'll come back to in a minute, a clue that led me then to looking in to Dorothy Kilgallen's life and times and death. But working on the book with Belli got me to wondering. 2 things bothered me. Number one, why was he hired as Ruby's lawyer when he had no experience as a criminal defense lawyer? And second, why did he use this ludicrous psychoepilepsy insanity defense at trial, which basically was saying that Ruby was crazy and out of his mind when he shot Oswald? And there was a third thing. He never let Ruby testify. So I started looking into all of that and wondered about his connections to the mafia because his main client at the time was Mickey Cohen, who was a Los Angeles gangster and connected to all of the other gangsters across the country. So to make a long story short, my research showed that what I needed to do to really understand what happened with the JFK assassination was to go back to the 1960 election. And if you recall, John, there's no question that Joe Kennedy knew they were going to lose that election because Richard Nixon was going to carry too many states. And he knew, Joe did, that they had to win West Virginia and Illinois. Now, Joe's background is, as curious as anybody's. Joe was a bad guy. And at one particular point, as the patriarch of the Kennedys, he thought he might become president of the United States. But when he was ambassador to Great Britain, he was too friendly with Adolf Hitler. And that came back to haunt him when he came back here. So he said, basically, all right, I got all the power and the money. If I can't be president of the United States, my sons will. And people in my books have been shocked when I say his real plan was to have Joe Kennedy, his son, become president. Then it would be John, then it would be Bobby, then it would be Ted. Well, Joe got killed in the war. So first up then, that would have been 32 years of Kennedys.
Right.
But when Joe got killed, he turned his eye toward John. And so we get to that particular election, and Joe knew he was going to lose. And so he called in some of his underworld mafia figures, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and one of them named Carlos Marcello, who was a mafia don in New Orleans and whose empire stretched to Dallas. So Joe gets help from these people through Frank Sinatra connecting them. And lo and behold, the mobsters do what they say they'll do. They win the election for Jack Kennedy. But the deal that Joe made with the devil really was that if they helped him win the election, he would leave them alone when they got in the White House. The Kennedys did, wouldn't prosecute them, wouldn't come after them, and all that. Well, that quickly dissipated when I had a witness who was right there when Joe ordered JFK to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And he did so, and predictably then, the first thing Bobby Kennedy did, because he hated those mafia guys based on what he had encountered during the McClellan hearings, the racketeering hearings a few years earlier, he really went after them. And one of those was Carlos Marcello. As I said, a New Orleans don, empire, gambling, prostitution, whatever it was, made millions and millions of dollars. His empire stretched to Dallas. So the first thing that Bobby did was to deport Marcello in violation, in a double cross, to Central America, in the wilds of Central America. And you can just imagine this mafia don loping around the trails in the jungle with, not the correct clothes or shoes or anything. Well, he finally got to a city where he could get back to the United States using his friends and a small plane. And when he got back in the United States, boy, he vowed revenge over what Bobby had done. So now we get to the end of, toward the end of 1963. And Marcello is continually being pursued by Bobby Kennedy. He can't get him off his back. Not only is he going to deport Marcello again, but he's got him in federal court in New Orleans, charged with racketeering. Well, I've always looked at the JFK assassination a lot differently, and I did so in the first book looking at this, the Poison Patriarch, how the actions of Joseph P. Kennedy caused the assassination of John Kennedy. And the way I look at it, John, is that why wasn't Bobby Kennedy killed in 1963 instead of why Jack Kennedy was? And that wasn't my great idea. It came to me from Jack Ruby's prosecutor, who, of course, prosecuted Ruby, won a death sentence, a conviction, and all of that. And he said, well, Bobby has many more enemies than Jack. And so what I realized when JFK was assassinated, that Marcello decided, look, if I kill Bobby Kennedy, who I hate with everything I am, then Jack Kennedy will come after me with everything the government has. But if I kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy will be powerless. And John, that's exactly what happened. Bobby Kennedy finally resigned as Attorney General. They never went after those guys again. So that clue that I told you about, I felt like I had proven a good logical way that JFK was killed. Being a curious guy like you and wanting to find the truth like you, I remembered a quote that was given to me when I worked on the Melvin Belli book. And that was from a doctor friend of his who, out of the blue, just as we were ending his interview, said, well, you know who Dorothy Kilgallen is? I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, she's the famous What's My Line panelist, but also, Mark, she had a newspaper column, circulated, syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country. She had a radio show listened to 1 million people a day, and she had What's My Line? She had all that. But Mark, she covered the Jack Ruby trial. And I said, what? He said, yeah. And, it's interesting. When Dorothy died, supposedly of an accidental overdose in 1965, Bell I said, well, they've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Jack Ruby. Every time I say that, that gives me chills, and it just did again. So being a curious guy, I started investigating who Dorothy Kilgallen was and what happened to her in 1965. We should remember here, by the way, that these three subjects I talk about in Collateral Damage, and what I'm trying to do is to resolve three of the most mysterious, mysterious true crime murder mysteries in the 20th century. And so you have to remember that Marilyn died in August of 62, JFK in November 63, and Dorothy Kilgallen 65, within 40 months of each other. And then if we want to go further, we can go up to 68, where Bobby Kennedy is killed. It was a terrible, tragic, violent time during then. So I started looking into Dorothy, and I found out those credentials she had. And I found out that she was the only reporter to have attended the Jack Ruby trial who actually was in the front row and interviewed Ruby. And it was amazing to me. I found her columns, which people can look at on the Dorothy Kilgallen story.org. She wrote the Oswald file must not close. She wrote all of these articles questioning this ludicrous theory that J. Edgar Hoover had, that it was Oswald alone and all that. She didn't believe that. So after interviewing Ruby, where did she go? Well, she went to New Orleans. And she started to look into a connection, and I believe she proved one, between Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Marcello. And I will tell you, in Collateral Damage, I've confirmed those connections, among others. So Dorothy does that, and then she made a big mistake, and we'll compare it to the big mistake that Marilyn Monroe made a little later. Dorothy was a blabbermouth. She went back to New York City, and she said, after the New Orleans trip, I'm going to crack this case wide open. If the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, it would cost me my life. I'm afraid for my life and my family. I bought a gun, and she just, couldn't wait to tell everybody what she was going to write in a book for Random House. Well, shortly thereafter, Dorothy was found in a bedroom in her townhouse that she never slept in, a bed she never slept in, and John, she had on makeup, a hairpiece, and her makeup, hairpiece, and
eyelashes.
what else? What's that?
Eyelashes?
Yeah, false eyelashes. Her reading glasses weren't around. It just didn't make a lot of sense. But it just, if anybody looked at it, it looked like a staged death scene. Well, they found an empty Seconal bottle by the night table, on the night table there, and the medical examiner came, a junior medical examiner, and a detective came, and they looked around and said, well, here's another celebrity, that overdosed. And so that was the verdict. Dorothy Kilgallen supposedly died of an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol, and then they added circumstances undetermined. Well, that always bugged me, because that really means, that you don't know exactly what happened. And I was able to confirm that for the book Collateral Damage by interviewing Dr. Michael Baden. I was on a radio show with him, and I pretty well shocked him out of his seat when I said, your name was on Dorothy Kilgallen's autopsy. No, that couldn't have happened. I said, well, here it is. And so I showed it to him. And I said, did you agree with that verdict, that decision back then? He said, well, I can't exactly remember. And I said, well, that I was able to prove, Dr. Baden, that Dorothy didn't have just one barbiturate in her system. There were three: Tulinol, phenobarbital, and Seconal. And we were able to show that there was powder on one of the glasses. It didn't really make sense that she would have overdosed that way. And he scuffled around and said, well, that may be true. And I said, well, that really was a terrible decision that you and your compatriots made, because that's what was given out to the media, that she overdosed it and all of that, when basically didn't know what was really what the cause was. And he said, well, yes, that's true, Mark. So I investigated Dorothy's death. I looked at who might have, what might have happened if she in fact was silenced at the time. That led me back to Marcello. It led me back to J. Edgar Hoover, who had the motive there and everything. Her JFK assassination evidence file disappeared, never to be found. I found out that FBI agents had actually swarmed the townhouse on the day she died, the morning she died, and confiscated all of her documents. We still haven't found that. And so I started to see if I could get the New York City DA to investigate Dorothy's death. Well, they did. They said they would. Big headlines in the New York Post. For 8 months, I worked with them, with a Detective Ramos there, gave him all of my evidence, told him about the last lover that Dorothy had in her life, Ron Pataki, a journalist out in Columbus, Ohio, that I thought he had betrayed her, that he was a Judas, and asked them to investigate, and they did for 8 months. And then all at once, I got a telephone call that said, hey, we're going to stop this investigation. We're not sure we can prove it's a homicide. It's taking too long. It's too expensive. And I just about, had a heart attack.
Right.
And I said, well, wait a minute. This doesn't make any sense that there wasn't any harm to her. And then I'll never forget what he said. Well, Mark, you don't argue with us. We don't know who, and we don't know who did it.
Right.
So that was completely contradictory to the decision that they gave to the press at that particular time. Now I'm going to update just a little bit, and then we'll get into Marilyn. Just recently, about 6 weeks ago, I got a telephone call from a Detective Philip Panzarella, and he's with the NYPD Cold Case Squad. And he informed me that he was going to look into Dorothy's death. We corresponded via email. I sent him a long evidence report. I gave him the contact for all the witnesses, including Ron Pataki, all of that. And he swore he was going to go forward. So all of that looked great, except that, again, I haven't heard from him for a while. So I actually called him, sent an email to him yesterday saying what's going on. But at this particular point in time, my hope is still that he will go forward with the investigation. All my emails to him, I've posted on my website, markshaw.com. So that's where that stands. And let me just take a breath, and you can ask anything you want about all of that. And then I'll show you how I ended up getting into writing this new book.
Sure. First, I have to say, just your grasp of all of that knowledge is impressive, to be able to convey that so concisely and so clearly. And I think that's one of the things that I really admire about your books is you take, very specific material and you present it in a very readable fashion. So it's not dense. It's not one of those books that you can't get through because it's technical jargon. It's not at all like that. It almost reads like a novel, except it's a true story. And I guess that's appropriate because they say truth is stranger than fiction, and that would certainly, seem to be the case.
Well, John, I tried to lay it out like a prosecutor would, or when I used to, I had no training as a long form writer. I was a terrible student at Purdue and high school and everything else, but I could talk to juries. So I try in my books to talk to the reader like I'm talking to a jury and lay out the evidence so that they can make up their own mind about what they think. But thank you for the compliment.
Sure, of course. And let me just ask you, and then, yes, let's get into Marilyn Monroe, because that's another fascinating, area, and so many, strange parallels with Dorothy Kilgallen that I think if people realized, they would be quite surprised at how similar the cases look. But I just wanted to ask, as an investigative reporter now, you have committed yourself to this for years and years and years. And I'm just wondering, what does Dorothy mean to you personally? Because she herself, as you mentioned, was an investigative journalist. She was at the Ruby trial. She, tried to expose it to the world when it really wasn't receiving mainstream coverage anywhere else. And it's pretty much, been forgotten until you revived it with the trial transcripts that are in this book, In Denial of Justice. But can you talk about sort of following in her footsteps, using her example as you pursue your own investigation, because you do enter her mindset throughout this book as to how she would have pursued her own investigation, whether it be JFK, Marilyn, or even, you following in those footsteps, looking into her very suspicious death.
Well, I pale in comparison to what kind of investigative reporter she was. I've gotten tremendous respect for her. I have her photograph right up here on the wall as inspiration. I have Marilyn's up there now. I'm trying to become a voice for both of them because Dorothy did not get justice in 1965. Marilyn didn't in 1962 as well. Right under a photograph of she and Marilyn, I have a saying that kind of stirs me on. It reads, "The deaf cannot cry out for justice." It is a duty of the living to do so for them. And so my job, I feel, is to try to find these distortions of history and correct them some way or another through my research. Dorothy has been a guiding light for me. I know people will think this is strange, but I believe she has. I think she chose me to write her story. Nobody had. She just basically disappeared from the face of the earth. Yes, there were a lot of those What's My Line columns up there, or What's My Line shows up on YouTube and everywhere, and now there's even more of them. But I'm going to take a little bit of credit. I think I kind of brought her back to life for people. But her investigative way of looking into to crimes, whether it was the Dr. Sam Shepard case, which became The Fugitive, or the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, the British John Profumo trial, whatever it was, she was really great at looking for the little clues in terms of what happened in those cases. And in Collateral Damage, I have a lot of her columns, both at the Ruby trial, but also otherwise. And it shows that from morning to night, when she felt like there was injustice in any particular case, whether it was a knifing in Central Park, or it was the Dr. Sam Shepard case, she went full blown. And she did the same thing with the JFK assassination, 18 months of investigation into trying to find out what happened. She and JFK were good friends. He had been to her house for parties and all that kind of thing. When she went to the White House with her son, Kerry, he made a fuss over little Kerry and gave him a PT 109 pen and all this stuff, and praised the letters that he had brought from his third grade class. In fact, I'll never forget the quote that I put in the book. She wrote, the man who, what I remember is a tall man stooping over a little boy, Kerry, when he was reading the letters from his third grade class. This is the man who was killed in Dallas. And it was personal for her, so, to find out what happened to him. And so, if I can use the diligence in any way that she used with regard to, whatever else I'm investigating, that's what I want to do. And so she's been a real inspiration to me. And I've gotten thousands of emails from people around the world who basically have just fallen in love with Dorothy and what she was like. I've had young journalists say that they may become a journalist because Dorothy was a college dropout. Right. And she worked through all the gender discrimination and became, what the New York Post called the most famous female voice, the most powerful female voice in America. Hemingway called her the greatest woman writer of the time. I don't know if she would have liked that or not, because she probably would have wanted men coming in there too. But she's celebrated. She was a media icon, and I just have all kinds of respect for her. But without her, I certainly wouldn't have been able to investigate the JFK assassination like I did. And there's no question that I would have never been able to write this book and include Marilyn Monroe in the mix in terms of my investigations.
Right. And I have to say, I remember how excited I was when I first found out about the reporter who knew too much, because being a student of the Kennedy assassination, not anywhere in your league, not even close, but, having read dozens and dozens of books and owning dozens and dozens more, her name would come up from time to time, but such little information. And, so she was always this fascinating figure in history that pretty much was a footnote and, never really got the due diligence that should have come her way. So I think that it's great that not only have you revived interest in her death and the possibility of justice, but also, bringing back her career, what she stood for, who she was, what she accomplished, because so much of that was, wiped away for the longest period of time. So kudos to her, because she is fascinating and what a phenomenal talent.
Well, she certainly was. And, I had no idea. The reporter who knew too much just took off, became a bestseller and all that kind of thing. And then I looked into denial of justice because I found the Ruby trial transcripts that clearly showed what Dorothy knew from the front row seat that she had, that there was a plot to kill JFK. I mean, you can read it right in there. This phone call that this gentleman, credible witness, heard with Jack Ruby right before he shot Oswald. I will be there when he's transferred. The police will help me get into the basement. I'm going to act like a reporter, and so on and so forth. Well, all of that just blew my mind because it was right there. A lot of times, John, the truth is hiding in plain sight. It's the same thing with Marilyn's case, as we'll talk about. But Dorothy was on the job. She's the most credible reporter to have ever covered the JFK assassination. And there still are places like this dreaded sixth floor museum at Daley Plaza that I've been trying to get closed because all they do is present Oswald alone. It's a shrine to Lee Harvey Oswald now. And they won't even stock books about Dorothy or anything like that, or anything adverse to the Oswald alone theory. It basically distorts history for all of those young people, students and teachers and everything that come through there. And I'm going to march to Dallas again in July next month and give a talk at the Allen Public Library, where the last time that I did, there ended up being almost 1 million views of that YouTube presentation. I'm going to go back there and start yelling and screaming about that particular, the sixth floor museum, because for whatever reason, they just continue to distort history. And that's just, this is all about history. A lot of people might say, hey, this happened almost 60 years ago. Who gives a damn? Well, this is history.
Right.
And for people to understand what happened back there, especially young people, it's important that we give them the facts and then let them make up their own mind. But I'm really excited about the fact that even though I'll tell you I wasn't going to write this book, I'm glad I did, because when well, just let me explain that just a little bit.
Sure.
Look, I'd already investigated the JFK assassination, 63. Dorothy in 65, those deaths. I connected them for sure. But what about Marilyn? Well, people all over the world kept asking me one question. Is there a connection between Dorothy Kilgallen and Marilyn Monroe's death? And I didn't think there was at all. Besides, I'd written enough. I was done. But I decided to at least look into that. And the first thing that I found was a column that Dorothy had written about, I have it right here. Again, these documents are the most important thing, John. And here's a photograph of Marilyn and Dorothy together, the one that I have up on the wall. And then she wrote 2 columns that I found about Marilyn, 2 of which showed me the kind of mental state that Marilyn was in. Now, Marilyn died in August of 1962, and the first official verdict was that she had died of what they called a probable suicide, which again makes you think of overdose of barbiturates, circumstances undetermined. In other words, they didn't know what had happened. But that's not the verdict they gave to the media. And so we had these headlines, one of which I have in the book, Marilyn kills self. Well, that was false then, and it's false now. But anyway, I started to think about and find these documents. And Dorothy had written a column called Marilyn, the Golden Girl loses third marriage pursuing love. And it got me to thinking about who Marilyn Monroe was. And there had been a ton of books written about them. I didn't want to write them. Another one like it. I didn't look at them. All of my sources, documents, witness accounts, books are all from 1965 and before. I wanted current material about what happened back then, not these authors who've written about the JFK assassination, Vincent Bugliosi and Posner, and all of these guys who just had no idea really what was going on because they weren't there like Dorothy was. So I started looking into that, and that's the first one. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting to know exactly what her mindset was just before she died on August 4th, 1962. Well, I found this column. Marilyn Monroe has Hollywood talking again. And basically it said, Marilyn Monroe's health must be improving. She's been attending select Hollywood parties and has become the talk of the town again, and so on. And she's cooking in the sexual appeal department. She's proved vastly alluring to a handsome gentleman who is a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio, that was her former husband, in his heyday. So don't write off Marilyn as finished. So I got that information and I thought, wait a minute, that's not a woman who's suicidal. Certainly doesn't sound like it to me. I then found a book that is absolutely amazing. I should have brought it forward and let you take a look at it. It's called Fragments, because I want to know about Dorothy, or about Marilyn. Basically, it was said that she was a dumb blonde. She didn't, she couldn't think for herself. She didn't have intellect or anything like that. Well, I just right off the bat found material that said that just wasn't true. And this book, Fragments, for instance, that I'd encourage anybody to take a look at, is full of her poetry. Her little inscriptions she wrote on the back of stationery in hotel rooms and all kinds of things like that. I mean, it's just amazing, you know, that she had that kind of intellect to do that. For God's sake, she read Ulysses, which I tried to read and couldn't. There were other indications, both from her masseur at the time, that she was in the best shape of her life. Her publicist said she was looking better than she ever had, and she was just full of life and all that. So it really made me wonder what was happening with Marilyn and why she would have committed suicide at that particular time. She also had been offered a Broadway play, and that was always a goal, a dream of hers, because she wanted to be treated as a bona fide, serious actress. So it was the next Dorothy column, though, that really, I remember shaking my head and saying, okay, not only do I think there's something fishy about Marilyn's death, so did Dorothy Kilgallen. And it's an article that she wrote just a few days after Marilyn died. It was called Martha Proves She's a Trooper. It was about Martha Ray, the actress, but in there, just a little bit about that. And then she wrote that she was getting all kinds of mail from her readers asking questions, and the same questions she was asking. For instance, why was Marilyn found in the nude? She never slept in the nude. Why was there a light under her door? She never slept, she always slept in the dark. Why was there no glass there if she ingested 40 to 50 barbiturates? On and on and on, you know, that way, in terms of things that she wondered about. These barbiturates, how could they have been taken at this time and then she didn't die till that time? It would have, you know, why were her doctor and her psychiatrist both called there? Why would they call a psychiatrist? And so on and so forth. And then I found their accounts were confusing and everything. So it made me wonder, hey, something's wrong here with regard to this. John, I next found, as in my investigative journey, I wanted to look at the autopsy. That's what had really made a difference in Dorothy Kilgallen's death. It had never been published before. I found it in the National Archives. In Marilyn's case, I found the original copy of the office of the coroner. It's right here. It'd be tough for people to read, but they can read it in the book. And here's the verdict: acute barbiturate poisoning, ingestion of overdose. So the first thing they did at 10:30 a.m. on August 5th, 1962, just a few hours after Marilyn had died, they decided it was an overdose. By 3:40 in the afternoon, the certificate of death goes down here and it says probable suicide. So something happened during that time to change the verdict, basically, in her death to probable suicide. You know, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Cyril Wecht, yes, but he's probably one of the most amazing forensic scientists who's ever lived, covered all the big cases and everything else like that. When I told him that was the verdict, probable suicide, he said, Mark, I've conducted more than 16,000 suicides or witnessed them. I've never seen probable suicide. Basically, they guessed. Right. And the coroner at that time was Dr. Thomas Noguchi, infamous later on for the Michael Jackson cases and others, Natalie Wood. Really, his credibility suffered a great deal after that. But John, if you can believe it, he finally said in an interview just after, I guess it was a short time or whatever, after Marilyn had been, killed, that he'd made a mistake during the autopsy. He forgot to examine some of her inner organs, if you can imagine. And he said, and by the time that I knew that I had made a mistake, they were gone. Well, that's just a half-ass, bogus autopsy and made no sense whatsoever to me. And so then I said to myself, well, as you would, I think, something happened here. If she didn't die of this overdose, probable suicide, then what happened? For any reason, could she have been silenced like Dorothy Kilgallen was? And that led me to thinking, who was in her life who would have motive to have killed Marilyn? Well, the first guy I thought of, I think you would have too, was John F. Kennedy. Everybody pretty much knows that Marilyn and JFK had a very brief affair. This is the three of them, Marilyn, Bobby, and JFK. It's the only picture ever taken of them, apparently. It's in the book. And this is right after Marilyn sang Happy Birthday in Madison Square Garden to the president on his 45th birthday, which is just a year away from when he's going to die in 1962. So I wondered about Jack Kennedy, but I found out that was a very short-lived relationship because Joe Kennedy finally said, and his sons always, obeyed Joe. Listen, you can't be messing around with Marilyn Monroe, and so you need to dump her because you're going to be running for election in '64. Now, this is Joe Kennedy, who actually at one point, as you may know, shared a girlfriend of his, Judith Exner, with Sam Giancana. They were dating her at the same time, a mobster. Anyway, that blows my mind. So then I thought, okay, how about Bobby? So I started looking into him to see if there was a relationship there. And the first thing that I found out was that he was in LA in June, July, and just the first few days, as I will prove, of August 1962. And John, he was working on a book. I had it here a little while ago. It was called The Enemy Within. He hated the mafia, and he wrote a book about them. And he just made fun of them, and they look like girls, and the way they dress, and their oily hair, and everything. I mean, he really detested the mafia. And he was in Los Angeles because there was a potential to turn that book into a movie.
Right.
And I proved he was around. There's a book that I had by Frank Capel, for instance, The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe, that basically had ledgers from the Beverly Hills Hotel and other things that showed Bobby was there. So then I said, well, what's the proof of a relationship here? And the first thing I came across, I remember the morning it happened. This is a letter from Gene Kennedy Smith to Marilyn Monroe in July 1962. Marilyn, understand that you and Bobby are the new item, ! We all believe you should come back with him when he comes back east. Love, Gene Kennedy Smith. That's the sister of JFK. Prima facie, primary source evidence that yes, there was a relationship. And then, as I like to do, I like to look for government documents that nobody else has found. And I came up with a CIA document that was exposed, that was published, or that was sent out to various people, which happened just the day before Marilyn died. And I'll just read you a couple little excerpts here that hit me like a ton of bricks. Robert Kennedy has been having a romance and sex affair over a period of time with Marilyn Monroe. Robert Kennedy was deeply involved emotionally with Marilyn Monroe and reportedly promised to divorce his wife to marry Marilyn. Eventually, Marilyn realized that Bobby had no intention of marrying her and about this time, and so on and so forth. So I thought, well, here's what happened. Bobby dumped her, just like JFK had. He wouldn't answer her calls, I found out, to the Attorney General's office. He wouldn't, when he came to Los Angeles, see her anymore. He wouldn't come over to her home. They wouldn't go to Peter Lawford's beachfront home and have these sexual affairs and all of this. And I put in the book a visual that I think is really important here. You can imagine Marilyn starving for love, as Dorothy had written about, sitting by the phone, having picked up the phone and called Bobby Kennedy and being told by a secretary, well, he's away, or he doesn't have time, or whatever. I'm sure she just cried her eyes out. And that's the two Kennedys. That's what they did to Marilyn Monroe. They used her. And then there was the coup de grace. There was a party that was held up on the California-Nevada border at Cal Neva Lodge. And that party was attended, it was a week before Marilyn died, by both Kennedys, Frank Sinatra, Sam Giancana, a man named Gianni Russo, who's written a wonderful book that fills in a lot of holes about the JFK assassination in Maryland, called The Hollywood Godfather, and very credible accounts of what happened. But apparently at this party, Marilyn got the idea that she was going to be passed around sexually. And according to Gianni Russo and another witness that I found there, she started screaming, "Get me out of here, get me out of here." She called DiMaggio, come get her. Finally, she got back to Los Angeles, but before she left, she made the same sort of mistake like Dorothy Kilgallen did when she said, I'm going to crack the JFK assassination wide open. She said, I'm going to the media with this. And as one witness, when that happened, told me, said, by that time, Marilyn was dead. she was going to be dead. And then I went back to that CIA document that I read about the relationship between Marilyn and Bobby Kennedy. And it really, okay, could they have silenced her because she was going to go ahead and expose the love affair she had with Marilyn and Bobby? Well, that would have been bad enough for the Kennedys. I mean, for God's sakes, Bobby's married to a woman with 16 children or whatever it was, 12 children or whatever. The JFK's got Jackie. Both of them were womanizers, just like their father was. But in this document, basically, it connected Dorothy Kilgallen, Marilyn Monroe, and JFK through a very strange situation in the first paragraph, showing that all three of them were obsessed with UFOs, and that JFK was going to examine more about UFOs in Arizona, whatever that area was where they supposedly had seen them and all of that. And it dictated all of that, but it connected those three. And that made me see again that there was a connection between the three subject of the books and Collateral Damage. But then it was the two sentences after that that gave me the motive for why Marilyn Monroe died. The subject has told the Attorney General that she may go, the subject has threatened to go hold a press conference and tell all basically about the romances. But then the next line, the subject Marilyn will make references to bases in Cuba and the president's plan to kill Fidel Castro. Well, obviously those were matters of national security, whether it was pillow talk or the Kennedys were trying to impress this trophy in their life, Marilyn Monroe, I don't know. But it was one thing to have threatened to expose their love affair, John, but when she was going to go to the media with matters of national security that were given to her, which would have been treason almost, they could not let her live. So one of my basic problems was there was a book that I had found called The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe, as I told you. Right. This particular author was very authentic in what he wrote about the Kennedys, to the extent when the book had come out, they and members of the FBI, the Kennedys, were going to go out and buy all the copies so nobody could read it, because it was so authentic in terms of the relationship between Marilyn and Bobby, and the motive for him having silenced her. But Frank Capel wrote, the ruthlessness of this man, his utter disregard for the rights of others is frightening, and so on and so forth that way. And so that gave me even more feeling for the motive of Bobby to have been involved in Marilyn's death. The biggest obstacle there then was showing that Bobby Kennedy could have been in the vicinity of LA at least. I mean, he could have obviously ordered the death of Marilyn, but I had to feel that he was in the vicinity. So he had an alibi that he was up in San Francisco. But I started looking and I basically just destroyed his alibi in the book. 20th Century Fox Studios ledger. Before 11 a.m. on August 4th, 1962, the same day Marilyn died, a helicopter landed at the 20th Century Fox Studios helipad near stage 14. Studio publicist Frank Neal, working that Saturday morning, said he saw Robert Kennedy jump out of the helicopter and rush to a dark gray limousine waiting nearby. Neal said he got a glimpse of movie star Peter Lawford, brother-in-law to Kennedy, sitting aside. So obviously he was in the vicinity. And then I found a book written by a Beverly Hills police officer named Lynn Franklin, who talks about the fact that at midnight, after Marilyn would have been killed, as I proved, he stopped that limousine, and because it was going 75 and a 30 on Wilshire Boulevard in West LA. And what did he see? Peter Lawford was driving, Bobby Kennedy was in the back seat, and who was in the front seat with Peter Lawford? Marilyn's psychiatrist, Greenson. So that really let me know that, hey, this Bobby Kennedy was a liar at that particular time and all of that. I went ahead then and found some FBI memos that really gave me an idea of exactly what they believed at the time. And I won't go into detail with them, it's in the book, but basically they were aware of the love affair and had suspicions about whether Marilyn could have been killed. Right. If you want the final answer to this whole situation about Dorothy, I mean, in fact, in one of the FBI memos, it said, some of the allegations of the author are from public sources and apparently true. And then it talks about the copies being said. But the most fascinating article that I found at the time was one little known by a European journalist named Martha Donaldson. And actually, I found it in a photoplay magazine. It's amazing where you can find things at times. I have no idea how this came to me, except Dorothy perhaps sent it to me, or Marilyn sent it to me from the hereafter. I don't know. But it was amazing in terms of 1 year later, Marilyn Monroe's killer still alive. And she goes into saying you'd see him in a crowd. You know, he's he's always on television, and so on and so forth. And maybe you'd think, well, I wish I were his life. You can read about him almost every day in the newspapers and magazine. You'll think that is a good person. This is truly an honorable man. But you will never read, never see, never know that this man is a killer. He's the man who killed Marilyn Monroe. And this was based on her interviews with many of Marilyn's friends and things like that. So where did I go from there? I looked into the barbiturates that were in her system, 3 of them, or 2 of them, phenobarbital and chloral hydrate. And I found a prescription for chloral hydrate to do my diligence. Mm-hmm. And basically what I came up with, and it will be in the book, and I don't want to give away the ending because I want people to see whether my progressive journey makes sense as to what happened to her. But there were 3 clues that I found. One was in the autopsy in terms of the kind of barbiturates found in her stomach and how they may have been given to Marilyn. The second one was that the housekeeper, the maid, when the police arrived, was doing the laundry at the washing machine in the middle of the night. All right. So that one bothered me. And then there was just this other one that I think Dorothy Kilgallen would have centered on. And that was that in the autopsy, John, it said that basically there was a fresh bruise on her hip. Right. And I wondered, how did that get there? Could there have been foul play at her home? And in the book, I show that I believe that's what happened, that Bobby Kennedy's operatives went to that home. We know that in the afternoon, Peter Lawford and Bobby Kennedy went to the home and pleaded with her not to go to the media. She refused. And so I set up what I think is a plausible solution as to how she died. Now, this is the guy that covered it up. This is Bobby Kennedy's good friend, Robert Parker, the police chief. Instead of an investigation like in Dorothy's case, no investigation instead, like in Dorothy's case, this one was no investigation. Right. They never talked to anybody. They didn't even look at the death scene. They just decided, Parker did, to appoint 3 psychiatrists to provide an opinion as to how, what kind of state of mind Marilyn had. And predictably, they came back and said she was suicidal based on no evidence of that or a drug problem, really. And the case was closed. So to that end, I've written this letter to the LA County District Attorney, asking him to investigate Dorothy's death. And the conclusion basically in the book is this, John, that if in fact Bobby Kennedy would have been prosecuted for Marilyn Monroe's death in 1962, based on all of the evidence, there would have been no JFK assassination because Bobby's enemies who killed JFK to render Bobby powerless would not have had to do so because Bobby would have already been powerless, which means there would have been no JFK assassination. And then there would have been no death of Dorothy Kilgallen in 1965 because she'd have had no JFK assassination to investigate. Right. So the title of the book, Collateral Damage, is basically that the deaths of Marilyn Monroe, JFK, and Dorothy were collateral damage of Bobby Kennedy's abuse of power and his violent behavior in 1961 and 1962. And what I hope to at the end of the book, you may remember, is I try to humanize each of these individuals, what we lost, what they lost. Dorothy Kilgallen was the mother of 3. She never got to play with her kids or do anything. John F. Kennedy had 2 little kids. He never got to play with them. The only thing Marilyn Monroe really wanted before she died was to marry Joe DiMaggio and possibly have a baby. So we lost them. We don't know what JFK would have done as president. We don't know what Dorothy would have done as an investigator, and we don't know what Marilyn would have done to light up the screen with movies or whatever. And so I wanted to let the audience of the book know, hey, this is what we lost. And Bobby Kennedy needs to be held accountable. I'm already getting a lot of criticism for, bashing the Kennedys. But this is a bad family. And I just will leave you with this. I found a guy who lived in Boston at the time the Kennedys, the sons were, in their 20s, and Joe was there. He used to tell me that they would go into a restaurant and they would eat and they would just leave without paying. Now, I know that sounds like a little thing, but what it is that they just were so privileged and thought they could get away with anything. They had no rules or whatever. They were womanizers. And in Bobby's case, in my opinion, he should have been charged with murder. So, I'll stand with what I've said about the Kennedys. I know they had good sides to them. There's no question. Bobby may have saved us from a nuclear war with Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK and he were, civil rights people and all that. They did some good things. But boy, there was a dark side to both of them.
Right, right. And so much, senseless tragedy. And it's interesting, too, because this book, kind of brings you full circle, because The Poison Patriarch, which was all about Joseph Kennedy, and the things that he did, and, demanding that Robert Kennedy be made Attorney General under JFK's presidency, had that not happened, perhaps none of this would have happened. So it's almost like this is the bookend to those 4 books, plus the belly book. It's very interesting to consider. And if you don't mind, quickly, if we can just make a couple more points for people who are tuning in. So, you talked about Dorothy Kilgallen's Jfk assassination file, which, people had seen it. It was something that existed, and then, she died and it was gone, never to be seen again. And she was writing a book based on that. I think they said it was at least 50% complete in manuscript form. So, people knew what she was investigating. But then you also mentioned Marilyn Monroe, who, contrary to public opinion, was very smart, was a voracious reader, but was also a writer in her own right. And it's, pretty widely known these days that she kept notebooks and journals that people think chronicled, what was said between her and the Kennedy brothers. And immediately after she died, those went missing as well. So, we have the book, like the Fragments book that you mentioned, but none of, those more personal diaries based on the relationships that we had with the Kennedys. So it's an interesting parallel, that as soon as both of those figures died, their case files, so to speak, went missing as well.
Well, I will say this, there's so much, people use Wikipedia as a source, or they go into these, whatever they are on the internet and find this information. I will tell you right now, I've never been able to prove through reliable sources, credible sources, that Marilyn Monroe kept these journals or this diary or whatever. I've tried to see who said they saw it and all of that. Certainly her psychiatrist and her doctor, neither one of them. Her close friend, Pat Newcomb, who was her PR person, no. The masseuse, no. Even the maid, no. So whether they existed or not, I don't really know, and I don't speculate in my books. Maybe one day they'll appear. I don't know. Maybe somebody has them or whatever that way. But both women needed to be silenced. Dorothy Kilgallen, I will say, was a reporter who knew too much, and Marilyn was the actress who knew too much. And they never should have died at those early ages. Just think about it. Marilyn was 36, Dorothy was 52, JFK was 46. There were needless deaths, and it all goes back, like you said, to the desk and to Joseph Kennedy. When he was told, for instance, he knew what happened. Bobby Kennedy Jr. has said his father knew it was Marcello. But when Joe Kennedy was told of JFK's death, he threw the New York Times on a floor from his bed and just slumped over. He knew that he had caused the death of his son, JFK. So, and then there's this Kennedy's curse with all of the deaths and the tragedies that happened in that family. It continued into last year, where I think it was a nephew and a little girl died in the ocean in Boston, around the Boston. But life all comes back with what we do in our lives, and you have to wonder whether the dark side of the Kennedys has caused an awful lot of those kinds of things happening.
Sure. And just a couple more points, if you don't mind, and then I will let you get on with your evening, because you've been very generous with your time. But just to break down some of that information, in regards to Dorothy Kilgallen's death and Marilyn Monroe's specifically, if you think about it, there's some very interesting and sort of startling parallels. The manners of death, this supposed ingestion, of barbiturates, drugs that they may or may not have been on, can't even prove how they were taken, whether it was orally, rectally, an injection. So there's, questions about the manner of deaths themselves. Both scenes, it seems pretty clear, were staged with evidence that's incongruous with what we know. Like you said, Marilyn was naked in bed, propped in a way that was very unnatural for somebody who would have died of a drug overdose. Dorothy Kilgallen wasn't even in a room that she slept in, and she was dressed as if she was leaving, the house with a book that she already read, turned the wrong way, air conditioning on in November, so very, very strange. And then you also have the delayed reporting of the deaths to the authorities through proper channels. So you have hours and hours that go by in both cases where people who are intimate with the victims know that they have passed on, but the authorities, don't come in until many hours later. And then finally, as you spoke to, sort of botched autopsies in both cases that led to very flawed autopsy reports, which of course the media based all of their conclusions upon. And it's interesting to note that in both cases, the people who did the autopsies were not typically the people that would handle high profile cases. It was not the experts. It was not, the top people. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that or not, but it's just interesting when you consider, both death scenes and the immediate circumstances after. There are certainly some startling similarities between them.
Well, let's go to that autopsy situation, because in the book, I was able to stretch that out to not only the autopsies of Marilyn and Dorothy, but JFK.
Right.
Cyril Weck, again, you may remember, looked at all, he basically blasted the autopsies. They should have been done at Parkland in Dallas, but Hoover and LBJ whisked the body off to Washington, D.C., and it was some military guys who weren't, qualified to have done it. And you hate to see this in those kinds of cases, because there's always going to be question marks, in terms of what happened and who was hiding what or whatever that way. So that similarity jumped out at me for sure. But you are right. Most homicide detectives, and I'm, a former criminal defense lawyer, so I am familiar with these kinds of things. They tell you that if you don't really examine all the evidence within 12 to 24 hours, and even start talking to witnesses and things like that, the case is lost. And in both these situations, that never happened. And so all these situations, it never happened. I mean, even the autopsy with JFK, it had to wait all that time. So there's the opportunity then for corruption in those situations by those people who don't want the truth to come out. So you're very observant to have connected all of that.
Well, it's interesting. And like you said, in Dorothy Kilgallen's case, there were an incredible amount of people who were sort of in her house by the time authorities properly came to investigate, and many of them weren't even interviewed. Which is...
No, and Marilyn and Dorothy, like you said, she was dressed ready to go to a party.
Right.
And then this, I've asked the New York NYPD to investigate Ron Pataki. He's still alive today in Columbus, Ohio. He knows I've been after him and all of that, so I'm hoping that they will. And in Marilyn's case, I hope the LADA will go ahead and, really investigate Marilyn's death, because her reputation was basically ruined. I say in the early part of the book, what do people say about these three individuals? Well, Marilyn committed suicide. She was a drug addict. Dorothy overdosed, so she was a drug addict. And JFK, it was like, okay, well, one guy killed him, this nut Lee Harvey Oswald, and all of that. So none of them got the justice they deserved. And hopefully through my efforts, and I hope that my research, I think that I was very honored recently that my university, Purdue University, my alma mater, is going to be the archival repository for all of my books and research books and everything else like that. And those Ruby trial transcripts will be available, and so on and so forth. And I hope people will use my research to do their own research with regard to what happened back then.
Absolutely. And congratulations. That is a huge honor. I was thrilled to read that. I was very happy for you. And you just, mentioned the Ruby trial transcripts again. And if you wouldn't mind touching on this very briefly, because you've really, again, you've sort of revived Dorothy Kilgallen, but also, that whole trial and what it really showed. And the interesting thing is that, most of the world has this image of Jack Ruby as somebody who is so emotionally overwrought by the assassination that he basically coincidentally happened to be in the area and thought, oh, poor Jackie Kennedy, I don't want her to have to come back to Dallas and testify. So the opportunity is here. I'm going to take Lee Harvey Oswald out. But what the trial transcript basically proves is that he was stalking Lee Harvey Oswald that entire weekend.
No question about it. And, I've said before that the trail there that you can look at in terms of its viability is, okay, JFK is dead, and now Lee Harvey Oswald is arrested. Well, that's a loose end, and I believe because of his connection with Marcello and the motive there. Well, what do? You bring in a mafia lawyer or wannabe lawyer, Melvin Belli, and because then Ruby shoots Oswald. And I remember this witness who told me that when Belli was told that Oswald was dead, he said, well, now I have to represent Ruby. So I think he was ready to take this case because he had no business taking it. He got to Dallas. He took on the case. We go to the trial. He won't let him testify, that's for sure. He makes him look crazy. They lose the case, okay? And so now that button is, that part of the case is buttoned up, and so on and so forth. And so it's just, Dorothy used a lot of logic. Common sense logic. I mean, it's amazing that Purdue is doing what they're doing. It took almost 6 years to get through there with a degree. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I'm not the best researchist who ever lived. All of this has been around, but I was so fortunate this time because I looked at the desk kind of ass backwards by looking at JFK, then Dorothy, then Marilyn, even though Marilyn died first and all this. And I will tell you, when I did that, it just opened up all kinds of new information about all three deaths and all three of their lives and everything else. And so I don't know, at some particular point, Dorothy must have said, Mark, okay, this is how you're supposed to do it. And I will follow anything she tells me, so to speak. And so it's worked out really well. And hopefully this is my contribution to history.
Sure. So as an aside, really quickly, I will say that, I don't think you give yourself enough credit, but, you say you're sort of an unlikely writer, and yet you have several books to your name now. And so people who are interested, you actually have a nonfiction book about writing and publishing that they can check out. And not that long ago, you did a really great, something like a 2-hour sort of tutorial online that people can look up, sort of getting your wisdom and tips. So if people are interested in pursuing that career, even if they don't necessarily think it's the thing for them, they can certainly, check out those resources, and I think they'll find them very beneficial.
Well, all that information's at my website, markshawbooks.com. Besides my writing, I love to mentor writers, people who, aspire to be published and so on and so forth. And so if there's anybody out there that wants to do it, I hope I'm an inspiration to people that if I can do this, anybody can. So hopefully I can help people along the way.
That's terrific. Thank you for that. And final question, it's going to be a two-parter because I know that you can take something big and make it simple for us to understand. But I did want to ask you, you are still pursuing justice in this case. You've talked about the fact that it's, again, maybe being revived, Dorothy Kilgallen's death through a full case investigation. But how can people, support justice for Dorothy and Marilyn and JFK? What can they do now? And also, what do you think that you're going to be doing next? I mean, I know that you didn't necessarily plan to write this book, so do you have an idea of what your future projects might look like?
Well, thank you. First of all, in terms of support, Philip Panzarella, Panzarella, is with the New York Police Department, NYPD Cold Case Squad, and it's not hard to find him. That people can email me. I'll give you the information, and you can get in touch with him, or you can call the NYPD office in New York City and just encourage this investigation that I've asked for. Same situation with Maryland. His name is George Gaston, the LA County District Attorney. I delivered to him a letter. The letter is up on my website, markshawbooks.com, and a a 325-page evidence report to him, giving him all the information about Marilyn's death and asking him to reinvestigate. Now, it's not an easy thing to get that done because obviously both the NYPD and the LADA, they have other things to do these days. But this is all about justice. And so I hope that they will, take this seriously and go forward. So we'll see what happens. But that support would be most appreciated. And if people want to email me at mshawin@yahoo.com, mshawin@yahoo.com, I answer every single email. And many times, I will say too, people come to me with tips about things, Dorothy's life and times or death. Maybe there's some people that know about Marilyn's death or what was going on in her life, or Bobby Kennedy. And I really do encourage that as well, because it really helps me. As far as something new, I'm going to obviously be involved with this book for some time and the promotion and everything, but there will be a paperback at some point. And I've actually, based on tips and a little more investigation, I've got some new material that will be in that paperback. So that'll keep me busy.
That's terrific. You are the man that never stops. I love it. So, Mark Shaw, the book is Collateral Damage. I highly encourage you to pick it up. It's interesting because, like I said, it's very accessible in the way that it's presented. And when you consider all of these deaths and circumstances in their totality, it makes a whole lot of sense. And it really does prove that sometimes the simplest answer, the obvious thing, is the correct thing. So I think that, if people pick it up, they're going to have a whole different perspective on what may have transpired. And I appreciate you sharing that with all of us today. Thank you, Mark.
Well, I want to return the compliment, John, because unlike many interviewers that I come across, you've done your homework. The questions are great. You let me go ahead and kind of tell the journey about this. So I have a lot of admiration for you, a lot of respect, and I really appreciate your having me on your program. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. It was a true pleasure. That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.